The Karate Kid Part 2 is a movie that wasn't really on a lot when I was a kid, or at least I don't remember it being on television that much back in the day. The first time I watched The Karate Kid Part 2 was on DVD. After everything that happened in Cobra Kai, it's fun to look back at this series, especially even the sequels, to see, and sort of compare where the characters were versus where they are. So, Karate Kid Part 2 has mostly the same creative team. Robert Mark Kamen is still the writer. John G. Avildsen is the director, and Bill Conti is still doing the music. It once again stars Ralph Macchio and Pat Morita, but the story took a very interesting turn. You see, with the first Karate Kid film, Mr. Miyagi became everyone's favorite character. Pat Morita was nominated and won several awards. Everyone was talking about wax on, wax off. It became part of pop culture. So when it came to approaching film number 2, taking a deeper dive into the history and the backstory of Miyagi made a lot of sense creatively. And I think it's because of that I do appreciate the movie trying something different, but it's just not, at least it's safe for me to say, it's just not going to connect the same way as the first one did, because the Joseph Campbell parable, the hero's journey, was perfectly encompassed in that first movie. This movie has a few different problems when it comes to its storytelling that I think is a problem that a lot of sequels end up having. When you have the hero's journey completed in the first film, you have to create another hero's journey for the sequels or do something different. And what they did felt like they were going in a different direction, but then by the end of it, it just became almost like a Saturday morning cartoon type of situation, because throughout the majority of the film, they're telling us this backstory between Miyagi and his childhood friend Sato, and they really paint Sato as being, the rival, and they really build up this sort of feud between Miyagi and Sato that goes back, decades over a woman. And then because of what happens, I would say near the third act of the film, in the second act of the film, Sato and Miyagi put aside their differences. Now, I'm perfectly fine with two characters putting aside their differences before they climax. And I get that putting aside their differences is much, much more closer to the principles and teachings of Miyagi-Do. So that makes sense. But the problem is that while they're building up this Miyagi-Sato fight, they're also building up a fight between Sato's nephew, Chozen, and of course, Daniel LaRusso, once again being played by Ralph Macchio. The thing about it is that I don't think they gave you enough heat. They didn't put enough heat on Chozen, I don't think, to have that fight really have the meaning it was supposed to have prior to the story changing. And all it really shows, and it's something that really hammered home during this viewing, is how much of a complete nut job Chozen is in this film. You look at his arc in Cobra Kai and all the good comedy stuff they have him doing in that show. And I do love those episodes where Daniel learns Miyagi-Do techniques from Chozen in Okinawa. But I feel like in this movie, he's absolutely insane. The fight and the feud between Johnny and Daniel in the first film, I think, was better written, and I think it made a lot more sense. In this movie, Chozen comes off like he's a villain of a Bruce Lee film, and multiple times when you're watching it compared to the first one, it's like, this is still a kid. The Karate Kid is still a kid in that universe. Ralph Macchio is obviously in his 20s by this point, but in universe, he's still a kid, and he's in here fighting literally for his life, having a fight to the death. And so when you look at that and you sort of compare it with what Cobra Kai did, it really isn't all that different. Season 1 of Cobra Kai is like the Karate Kid Part 1, very grounded and very, steeped in realism. Whereas starting with season 2 and up, things start to happen that are just completely out of control and that make no sense. And you've got these kids that you have to remember are just little kids. They're high school kids, basically. Maybe not little kids, but high school kids. And they're thrust into these like rumbles and these over the top, fights at the mall and, at the water park and things like that. And it puts a smile on my face because it just shows how insane and over the top the sequels got, and the Cobra Kai show sort of followed suit. It's weird, I think, for first time viewers, but it's one of those films and stories you have to sit there and let it marinate a little bit before you can really like sort of accept what's going on. Chosen is an absolute psycho in this movie. He will not let it go. This hatred he has for Daniel and Mr. Miyagi. He's so over the top. He makes these, almost like serial killer esque faces and is completely over the top. Now, the thing about the film is it does introduce a new love interest, Yuki, who, of course, would be a recurring character later on, but she's adorable in this movie, super likable. I think the issues with the film, well, first let me get into what I liked. The final fight between Daniel LaRusso and Chozen, when I was younger, I didn't like it, and there are some issues with some of the camera work, but I really did like it a lot more now as an adult. It might be one of the most badass fights in the entire trilogy. I mean, it really felt like a war of attrition. They're sitting there pounding each other. Man, there's blood. Like, we've come a long way from the All Valley. And it's not perfect, but it's still better than I had remembered, I guess you can say. Despite the utter lack of realism here, I do want to say, though, that aside from the a little bit of a messy script, I would say. They didn't transition out of the feud between Miyagi and Sato correctly, I don't think. The way the movie looks when I was younger didn't appeal to me because it wasn't in California where the other Karate Kid movies take place, but now I look at that as more of a strength. The film takes place in Okinawa, but it was shot in Hawaii. And if you've ever been to Hawaii, you can very easily see it because there's multiple shots in the movie in the background where you see mountains that are from the Hawaiian Islands. So they had to shoot in Hawaii. They built this little sort of mini town for the most part. Then the final battle took place. I believe that was shot at Pinewood, although I could be wrong about that. So I think that the visuals of everything, I think it looks great. The one thing that I find just, it's something you have to suspend your disbelief on that makes no sense when you apply logic, but within the movie universe it does, is the fact that in Okinawa, these characters that are clearly Japanese, characters where Japanese is their first language, are oftentimes speaking English. Like, it's weird to see Sato and Miyagi talking to each other privately, but still talking in English and not Japanese when you know that Japanese is their most native language. I thought that was just weird to me. Like, that's just something strange that I think they could have made an easy fix in the film, either with a storyline or like a reason as to why they speak English, or just having more subtitles on and having them speak in Japanese for a few of their scenes. The theme song for this movie is Peter Cetera's Glory of Love. It was a big hit, and I do like the song, although it feels, I would say, a step down from both Stan Bush and Survivor's contributions to the Karate Kid Part 1. Moment of Truth and You're the Best Around are just classic, like, just masterpieces when it comes to this type of movie. This one, not as much, but still a good song. Still a good song. The Karate Kid Part 2, I think, is a fun movie for the most part. The major issue that I have with it is that I think it is a bit too padded out and a bit too long. There were at least 7 or 8 times in this movie where you could have cut down on scenes and trimmed it to make it a shorter, tighter film. There are parts that I think could have been sped up or put in montage form. There are parts where conversations could have been shorter. Little things like that where I'm watching it and I'm sort of, when the movie's done, sort of reflecting on some of these scenes and wondering, could this have been executed better, faster, more fluidly? The final fight of the movie almost comes out of nowhere. Like, they've been building up this fight between Chozen and Daniel, like, on the back burner, but by the time the fight comes, it almost just happened, and it feels like the fight only exists so the movie can justify itself. Even Sato, Chozen's uncle, created this whole ceasefire to stop anybody from getting hurt. and yet he still wants to fight psychotically, and somehow Miyagi is okay with putting Daniel out there to fight, even though Daniel wanted to fight. It's just that part is hard to buy. But once again, Karate Kid Part 2 was doing only what Cobra Kai would do many years later by having these situations that don't work in the real world. I do think this movie should be seen by people who have seen Cobra Kai and not the Karate Kid trilogy, but it's also not one that I really enjoy revisiting too often. It does give a very similar vibe to kung fu films, especially Asian ones, because most of the cast in this movie is Asian, since most of the movie takes place in Okinawa. So it's a different vibe, but it's also not one where I think it really feels the same as the first film. Also, I should note that the opening scenes of this movie with Kreese beating up on Johnny Lawrence minutes after losing the fight to Daniel, and then having Miyagi get in the way and sort of defend Johnny Lawrence, that scene was originally written for the end of the first Karate Kid movie. That was in the script for the end of that movie, and they wound up taking that and moving it to the beginning of part 2. And it turns out that that's like the only scene with these actors. The Cobra Kai students, Kreese, Martin Kove, and William Zabka as Johnny Lawrence, they only have that one scene in the start of part 2. Then there's a 6-month time skip. It reminded me of like what happened in Avengers Endgame, how you have that first scene where they all go after Thanos, then there's a time skip, then the rest of the movie starts. That's how this felt. It's almost like you could start it at the 6 months later part of the movie where they skip ahead. You could start it there, and that is the real start of Karate Kid Part 2. And I will say that Cobra Kai and a lot of the lore from, what they added in Cobra Kai, I think makes this movie better, but it's not that enjoyable to watch. I liked watching it back this time. I'm not saying it's a bad film, but it's a movie that I would probably revisit maybe once every 10 years, maybe more than that. So I would say it's slightly above average or average. I wouldn't put it anywhere near how fondly I feel about the original Karate Kid film. I just wouldn't. And this came out like right after. I mean, this is also the one that had all the merchandise. The Nintendo game is more based on this one than the first film. So this one, I think, was probably after the first film got the most mainstream attention because of the way it was really pushed and promoted to kids and things like that. The cartoon was coming in a couple of years, I think 4 years, but it's just not as good. Like, the hero story was told much better in the first film, and instead of telling the Miyagi hero story, they sort of do tell that, but then they shift the final battle into it being Daniel and Chozen. And it's very comical. But yeah, Karate Kid Part 2, I enjoyed it. Looking back on it now, I still somewhat like the film, but it's got problems. And I think with some editing, they could fix those problems and have a much better flowing film. Nowhere near as good as the first one, in my opinion. What is yours? Let me know in the comments.